go. Excellent. Morning everyone. Good to see a great turnout here. Have a good night last night. Don't know if you know my business partner JD, he was out till about 4 a.m. He's unable to make it today. Cool, so my name's Jeremy. I'm an RD, an MVP, been around the development scene in New Zealand here for a while. Based down in Wellington, founded a company called Mindscape. Undoubtedly you're all our customers, so that's awesome. But outside of the product world, I do quite a lot with the web, and certainly we've sort of been involved in a number of startup ventures. They're web-based, and one of the things I've been really loving in my development life over the last few years is jQuery. And so I was asked to come and have a chat to you guys about jQuery. Awesome, I love talking about jQuery. I think when I first used it, day one, I was like, oh, jQuery rocks. Never looked back. For the session today, I'm going to be totally in the browser, really. Didn't think PowerPoint was appropriate here. This is a little web page put together with a bit of jQuery. So it is an awesome framework that I really think brings all the fun into developing client-side script JavaScript, which, you know, to be honest, used to be really, really painful. And I remember about 7 or 8 years ago working on, you know, like ASP-based websites, and you know, JavaScript was sort of seen as, yep, we can bring some client-side script. It's awesome. You know, it will give a bit of interaction to users. But it was really terrible to work with. You know, it was so primitive. We had a very limited set of tools to work with. Very much, you know, coding like in ASM and getting there from the ground up, document object element by ID, all this kind of garbage. Not so interesting. And the thing I really hated was dealing with things like cross-browser issues. Oh, if document.org, not so fun. So I kind of steered away from JavaScript for a wee while, left it to other people, and predominantly I think most people did the same. It just wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting. It was just monotonous. Roll forward a few years, and I came back to web development, and I was like, oh, what's out here? I've seen there's some interesting things going on. There's this library called Prototype out there that looks pretty cool. People in the Rails world are really raving about it because it's a library. It's kind of like .NET. We moved from things like ASP and VB up to this fantastic world of .NET where we had all of these classes available to us, all of this framework sitting beneath us that kind of removed all of that monotonous layer of work and kind of just made it really nice and easy and productive to do things. And it's that act of doing things that I find really enjoyable, and I expect in development you guys are the same. You make something work, woohoo! Awesome. And that's really what jQuery brought to me. And so I expect a number of you, probably most of you have had a look at it, had to play with it. And what I want to do today is just kind of walk through how we would build up our toolkit in our sort of thinking in jQuery to get really productive with it, and really the goal is sort of bring the web to life. So that's the jQuery part. What's life on the web? And I kind of put together a little cheesy kind of, anyone who's come to my sessions over the past few years knows I'm a bit of a PowerPoint ninja with animation, so I thought I had to try and replicate the same sort of thing here. To me, life on the web is kind of all about usability. It's about, if you think back originally, HTML was a markup language. It was all about getting documents online on a computer across a network. It's morphed a long way from those days into a content delivery system where people expect rich applications to be delivered to them on their mobile phones, all over the place at any time, all across the world. So that's the now, and so the web is all about, to me, is all about interactivity, about fun, about being kind of responsive. And really good examples of that are, a local New Zealand example is Xero. We use Xero at Mindscape for our accounting. I would totally recommend them. And the thing that I love about Xero is that they've kind of made a little bit of a game out of using their website. I'm not an accountant, I'm a developer, but I'm a business owner as well, so I kind of have to do the accounting each day. And I remember talking to my mother about this. She had a business, and she used to spend about 3 hours in the morning doing bank reconciliation. And cut a long story short, basically what I do for bank reconciliation each morning is little mouse click, bang, bang, hit that button, and it's all interactive. And that's really what a living web is to me. It's kind of fun, it's interactive, moves. Click on it. Okay, so jQuery is all good, and what's even better is that in our .NET world, it's very accessible to us. One of the really useful things that has happened over the past couple of years is Microsoft kind of teamed up with the jQuery guys and said, hey, your framework's awesome, we'd like to sort of bring in a bit of support for it in Visual Studio environment, so that ASP.NET developers can kind of make use of this framework really easily. The way to do that, a bit of IntelliSense into Visual Studio. So you used to, particularly if you use the ASP.NET AJAX libraries, you had the JavaScript IntelliSense. Basically, they just kind of wrote the IntelliSense file for jQuery, and that's kind of revved up with the versions of jQuery as it evolves. So that's a download off the jQuery site. You basically just drop it into a folder, and then it works. It's all good. Keep in mind, this is a JavaScript library, of course, so that's about the extent of the integration that you ever get. But that's kind of all you need. Of note, it does sort of coexist with other libraries, and particularly the ASP.NET AJAX libraries, which is kind of good if you've got an existing site and you want to kind of move up to jQuery off what you've got already, or maybe work hand in hand with those two things. Okay, so I'll just kind of, as I said, I wanted to just sort of progress through a number of techniques or things that you could do to evolve a site from something that's a little bit more static to something that's a little bit more interactive or living. And my example today is going to be my site, the Mindscape site, which I kind of get lumped with maintaining a little bit. JD and I kind of bounce it back and forwards like a hot potato. He's been ragging on me for a while to make a few updates. I thought, hey, I could just do them now. Excellent. So this site, there's nothing wrong with it. It looks good, of course, and it's functional, but it isn't particularly interactive in a number of ways. And the first thing, and this is a bit of a contrived example, but the first thing, and this is like the hello world of JavaScript, is expanding and collapsing divs. Very simple sort of technique for keeping your pages nice and light. Keeping the text off screen off view until people actually want to see it. And this is, something that pretty much everyone used to do, even back with primitive JavaScript. Right. So how do we achieve this sort of thing in jQuery? Very simple. And this is really where we start to delve into the real power behind the framework. So let's say we've got a little block here, like this guy, and we want to hide it. Easy. jQuery syntax for that. Well, we've got the $. And that's that. If you haven't seen any jQuery before, jQuery, when you bring it in, of course, you just kind of you go to jQuery.com. It's a good site. Download it. It's a JavaScript library. It's a file, of course. Add it in, and then you're away and running. The other way you can reference it, of course, is, and this would be kind of the recommended way of going about it if you're on the public internet, is there's both Google and Microsoft host a CDN version of the libraries. That's a useful way of including it into your site because it's a request to a different host so it doesn't get blocked. So it can be more concurrent, and more people have that cached from other sites, of course. Okay, so we've got jQuery all set up. We have a CSS selector syntax, and then .hide. And it was when I first came to jQuery, this is really what sold me on the framework, as opposed to other types of frameworks that I've seen in the past. It's this idea that if I want to operate on a group of elements, I select it like a set. And this uses CSS3 selector syntax. So I would say, dot info. So all elements on the page that have a class of info attached to them will be selected as a set, and then I can operate on that with a jQuery method. And you can chain these together, and that's where the fun really gets started. So we can hide that, we can fade it on in, and of course we can toggle things back and forward. Okay? Really, really simple. And particularly obviously hiding and showing a div, it was very simple before as well. Set the display property to visible, set it to hidden. But we don't have to worry about the semantics of the CSS behind that. We don't have to worry about the semantics of any cross-browser compatibility issues that might exist. Or IE6 works this way, and IE9 works this way, and Chrome works this way. All of that's baked into the framework, of course. The other thing that's quite cool is, we've got this fade in. That's a little animation effect. I didn't have to write that. A lot of these come out of the box. That gets interesting. That gets more exciting. Okay, so let's hop over to my site. Now I've got a registration page. Looks ugly. Let's quickly tidy that up. Register. See how we might look at this. And the other thing, the good thing I found about jQuery is it really starts getting you into the mindset of structuring your HTML better. Because you have to start thinking about what am I naming my elements, how am I structuring them with classes. So I've got the terms and conditions link is just a div which is called TNC, and then the text is a TNC text. So let's start that off hidden. Coupling along with jQuery, you kind of have to get your head around CSS, but that's not a bad thing, right? Again, just gets your head right into that mind space of the web. TNC, dot click. Here you go. You can see, here we go, this, there's a bit of that IntelliSense going on. So I've included that into Visual Studio 2010, and I can kind of see there, click, and it gives me a bit of help about what that function might contain. And interesting enough, that kind of just actually updates even to some of the plugins you bring in as well. So that's kind of cool. Function, and this is kind of like jQuery 101. TNC text, show. There we go. That's pretty boring. We'd probably maybe make it a toggle. Or a slide toggle. And so all of that sort of thing is pretty discoverable when you go to jQuery.com. One of the resources that they've got there that's really good for getting your head around what's available is their documentation. It's very good documentation by any standard. And so you can quickly go through, and they've kind of, let's bring up the site again. Documentation. You can see that they've kind of broken it down by the types of things to be working with. So, if you're looking at how do I select nodes, selectors would be what you're looking at, and there's a number of functions there. Or how do I traverse the DOM tree? Well, their traversal, manipulation, or so on and so on. So really good resource. Even, like I've been working with jQuery for a while, and I'm by no means that good at it, really. But even when you think you're good at it, that's still a useful resource to have up your sleeve. Okay. So the next thing I might want to do to improve the old Mindscape site is buttons. Now, one of my real beefs over the years has been image buttons and just buttons in general, because I'm not really a Photoshop guy, and so it's really depressing. You're building a website, and you're feeling all powerful, and then you go to create a form, and it just doesn't look right. Oh, I need a button, and then you have to call in a designer, or in my case, I have to call in JD, and he's like, "Oh, JB, you need a button, do you?" Not good. But these days, the web's improved, and we've got CSS styling buttons here. This is a pure CSS button that looks pretty much as good as that one. You can do gradient fills, and we can do rounded corners and all that interesting stuff these days. So that's, we can get past buttons. Well, they don't kind of function the same way. I mean, one of the things that buttons actually work quite well with is because you had input type equals image, you could lay it over the top of that and have a form submission work quite happily. You could lay it under an A tag and it would act as a link quite happily. But no problem. We've got jQuery on our side, and jQuery, of course, as we saw, makes it really easy to start wiring up events for things like buttons to control things like form submission. A couple of ways we could control form submission. We could have a wire up of our click function to just submit a form. That's pretty standard. Another interesting way, which is kind of useful if you're looking at building any kind of validation, or just like, oh, I want to delete this. Are you really sure? Is wiring up a global function for submission, and we could just do a test in there, like a bit of validation. So something like this. Oh, don't want to go through that. We shall pass. Okay, so let's pop back to the side, and I'll quickly swap out those buttons because I think that will impress JD. To press them at the same time, perhaps. So I'll quickly swap those out. If you're interested in this sort of approach, I think there was actually quite there's been a few articles recently. I don't know if you guys look at Hacker News, sites like that. People have been really putting a lot of information out there recently on, particularly I guess because people have been looking a lot with HTML5, combining HTML5, CSS and jQuery. People have been kind of really showing off all their tips and tricks about things like CSS buttons and things like that. So that's pretty easy. As you can see, we've got a little thing called fancy button there. It's got the text in there. Now it looks good. Now if I try and apply this to the login page where it's actually a form, doesn't work that well. So we'll have to swap that guy out with a form submission. So login button dot click, and we'll say login form dot submit. One of the other things to always consider when you're working with events, and jQuery makes it really easy to bind to events, as you can kind of see. We can say, everything that matches this, in this case it will just be one element, but it could be a set. Wire up a click event, and we can do that over and over. We can, JavaScript allows us to wire up these delegates from anywhere on the page, multiple delegates to an event. In the same way that .NET works, we wire up events in the same way with delegates. Keep in mind that for things like click, still operates the same way as normal JavaScript. It bubbles up the event tree, and then if we don't cancel the event, it will eventually trigger the HTML action. So in this case, we don't really want it to go ahead and, if we're clicking an A tag, we wouldn't want it to go ahead and actually click that tag or do a double submit. We would return false. So just keep those things in mind. They still are the same in jQuery as they are in standard JavaScript. So now we can log in. Cool. All pretty basic so far, I have to say. Now, the next thing I always like to do is look at doing a bit of dynamic styling to the site. And a good candidate for this is error pages. And this is a technique which I start seeing used more and more these days. I guess maybe it's just become a bit of a semi-standard, kind of works, is errors on forms. If there's an error, why don't you highlight the box that's an error and maybe focus me on that box. Particularly works well where you've got forms where the field in question is sort of below the fold. People have to start thinking, don't want that on the web, do we? So we'll use the script to our advantage and provide some of these sort of UI smarts. So classic example from our site, in fact, and this is from our live site, is we've got a form where you need to fill in your address details when you're purchasing a bit of software, the errors, what's wrong. Gee, I don't know. Well, possibly all of it, but why don't you show me? And again, this is really easy to do with jQuery. We've got a number of methods available for dynamically manipulating CSS properties, for adding and removing or toggling classes. .css, .add class, remove class, toggle class. You can kind of see there's a lot in this framework for quickly just doing stuff. And again, go to those docs. That's where they kind of enumerate all of this stuff for you. So just to show you a quick example of this, we can change the background by setting a CSS property of background color to, I think it's like AA. Or we can add and remove an error class. So this is the technique that we'll use for highlighting our errors on the form. So we'll just have a class called error or errored, and all it's going to do is draw like a 2-pixel border red around the input box. Okay. So popping out, let's go and buy something. I highly recommend you can try this at home if you want. Go to the page. Some of it's filled in, some of it's not. Click the button. Let's click that again, not move. Okay. Some stuff is wrong, and the stuff that's actually wrong, well, if I wasn't at such a high resolution, it would kind of be off the page, right? So I have to start looking for what's wrong. Oh, card holder name, where's that? Oh, name on card doesn't even match up to what the error said. That's unfortunate. This is a great candidate for showing me what's actually wrong. So we can quickly do that. Let's open up that page, check out step 2. And I'm using, this is an MVC-based site, just as an aside. So the way I'm sort of doing the validation summary here is I've got just enumerating the view data.model state and just emitting errors. And I'm going to pass through this a second time and use this to build up a little block of JavaScript. Now you could combine this. There's actually libraries for plugging in with things like MVC, xval. You may have heard of that, which allows you to bring a bridge between some of your server-side code where you've got validation frameworks there that are emitting errors, and then write out appropriate client-side script and maybe validators for you. Now I'm not that sophisticated, so I'm just going to do it this way, but keep that in mind when you're building your sites. xval might be a good one to take a look at. So I've got a little function that I'm going to use just to give myself a bit of reuse here called mark errored. And basically what it does is it's going to select an input tag, and you see that's a special type of selector here, an input. Again, you kind of find these things out from the docs. There's a couple of little shortcut conventions for certain types of selection. Angle bracket, square bracket, name equals, and so that's going to select me a specific input tag with that name, and then I'm going to add class errored to it. Okay. So I'm going to mark things up as an error. Now, first thing I'm going to want to do is say all the input tags should have their errored class removed. That will clear the state out. Then we'll mark errored state.key. That's going to be the name, and that's just a convention I'm passing through from my controller. And then another thing that might be nice to do is select now that we've marked them up, select the first instance of an input tag that has the error class applied to it and focus it. So just bring focus to that, and that, if we're overfold, it will scroll us down to that automatically. That's kind of a useful little thing to do. Cool. So we applied that, bang, it's just applied. Sensitive credit card there we go. So real easy technique. I mean, that just shows you with jQuery, some of these sort of things you probably, again, just sort of thinking back a few years, before we had these kinds of frameworks, you'd look at that and you'd think, oh, probably too hard. I'll go and do a search, see if someone's written something like this for me. Inevitably, what you're doing is always somewhat custom to your particular scenario, maybe the technology that you're using. They wrote it for PHP and it doesn't really sit well with .NET. jQuery kind of removes a lot of that hassle because you can see it's so quick and easy to do some of this stuff. Find all input elements which have the error tag. First one, focus, done. Don't have to worry about it. It's good stuff. Okay. Now we're starting to build up a little bit. What can we do next? Well, another pretty common thing that we might do is look at consuming server-side data. That's increasingly becoming more and more common, right? We start working with data on the server, start building up more of a dynamic application. People like, I know sort of people who advocate the idea that you could basically build a web page which only has JavaScript and just talks to RESTful services, doesn't have any real server-side logic behind it, we'll just put everything in client-side script. You could do it that way too. What I want to do though is kind of get rid of a common problem which I see, and it exists on our side, is these gigantic drop-down lists. Now this is a drop-down list of customers. It's like 10,000 entries long, unordered. How do I find anything in it? I don't really. I just kind of don't use it. How do we improve this? Well, again, this is kind of like this was like Ajax 101. Oh, we can build a autocomplete text box. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing we'll do here. And again, with jQuery, this sort of thing is kind of easy. Although not as easy as that I'll write it in one line of code, but it's the kind of thing where we start delving into the realm of plugins a little bit. But behind the scenes, fundamentally, there's sort of a couple of methods that we start looking at to talk back to the server. And again, this plays pretty well with ASP.NET MVC because we have very good control over the output that we're sending back. We can send back JSON serialized results. If you're using ASP.NET web forms, you might want to have a look at the great little local library, JSON.NET. That's really good for dealing with JSON concerns. Post or Ajax. Those are the two functions that you're probably going to want to use. Post, if you just basically just you are posting back some data to a form target. You specify the URL, you specify the pairs of data and a function to be executed on success of that post. So if it didn't 500 on us, then it will go ahead and execute for it. Ajax, we can do a little bit different. You notice here that there's that little angle bracket, squiggly bracket there, and this sort of is actually like a little it's a JavaScript array of options, key-value pairs. So type is post and URL is URL. This is a fairly common convention in the jQuery world, and you'll see it a lot with plugins. Is that people pass around the options for the plugin as one of these little arrays, one of these little objects of key-value pairs. So the Ajax function works like that, and this just gives us a little bit more fine-grained control. We can specify like the content type and encoding and things like that. Again, we can specify a success callback. We can also specify a failure callback. And a callback typically is just going to be another function which does work on execution of say success or failure. Takes in usually the XML HTTP request object, some data that came back and maybe the status code, and you can do with that what you will. Typically, if we're say doing an autocomplete text box, what we would probably expect to get back is a little block of JSON, which we then inject into a drop-down list or a div or something like that. So in my case, I'm not going to be that sophisticated. I'm going to be smart and go ahead and just do a search for jQuery autocomplete text box. And the one I kind of like to use is a little plugin called Flexbox. And this gives, basically the guy who wrote Flexbox, let's quickly pop it open here. Download it, it's just a JavaScript file, it's minified. Noah Heldman, Fairway Technologies, good work man. He's gone ahead and done all the hard work of writing an autocomplete text box that's very functional. It has, nice, highlights the keywords and, it gives us lots of different options as to how we can render things out. So I kind of like that. And what we'll do is we'll add it in to solve that problem I just showed you before. I've got an add software page, don't go to this URL, where I've got that drop-down list, and I want to replace that with an autocomplete box. So if I open that up, add software, and you can see here I'm including that Flexbox script in there. What can I do? Well, I can do this. customer ID.flexbox, and then this is where I'm going to be posting it to. This is just a URL which is going to map to an action in my MVC project. We'll show you that in a sec. Method is post. The width of the box is 500, so there's those options in use. What's this? It's going to be a div called customer ID. Haven't got that yet, so let's just chop all of that out. Customer ID. Lo and behold, we've got an autocomplete text box just like that. How do we know it's an autocomplete text box? Well, we kind of saw it auto-completing, of course, and if we go ahead and type that again, you see it's posting back to find customer. I think some of those are cached. John Daniel. There we go. So let's zoom in on that. So I posted it in. What do I get back? Bit of JSON coming back out the other side. Okay. So again, this is a sort of first foray into plugins, and when you get beyond the sort of basic offerings that jQuery gives you, and don't get me wrong, it's quite rich. It's like, you get into .NET and you've got all the base class library there, and that's great. But then you want to do some more fancy stuff, and you're going, oh, I don't want to have to write that myself. I want some high level building blocks to work on. Think, WCF, think some sort of Codeplex project that you've downloaded and use, the enterprise library, all those sorts of things that we find really useful in the .NET world. That's what the plugin community is for the jQuery world. And it's a very rich community, it's very large, and you generally can find a plugin for largely any kind of problem, standard problem that there is out there, and very discoverable. And the good thing about that community is it's not just .NET developers, it's all web developers. And all web developers encompasses quite a lot of people. So there's a lot of people using jQuery and a lot of people contributing back to these plugin libraries. Now, just quickly, I'll show you the code behind that customer method, that find customer, just so you can kind of get a feel for what you'd actually be putting in on the server side. Find customer. Basically, this is some MVC code, just using Lightspeed to find the appropriate customers, and then we're constructing them into a little list of objects, and then serializing that out with a JSON result. So nothing really too hard for us to do with MVC. Just have a list of objects which have an ID and a name, because that's the structure which this plugin expects to see back. It expects just to see back a list of these things. Serialize it using the JSON result. Could serialize it using JSON.NET, and then send it back on its way. Okay. And so whenever you're using POST or AJAX calls, that's probably what your methods behind this are going to start to look like. And there's some sort of plugin, if you're building MVC in particular, because that's the world I'm in, you can get conditional formatters, so that if I'm requesting with accept text HTML, render out a view, and if I'm requesting with application JSON, render out a JSON result. So you can start building in those sort of techniques as well if your site is friendly to humans as well as scripts. Okay. So now that we're talking about plugins, the sort of big obvious one to talk about is actually from jQuery itself, which is the jQuery UI library. And so when you download the core jQuery library, it's actually quite small. I think it's like 19K when it's packed and minified in gzip. That's really nice and includable. But it only contains the basic functions, and by basic I mean the base class library of functions for jQuery, all those things like add class, toggle, some basic effects, all the CSS stuff, all the stuff we've looked at so far, that's kind of in the base library. When you want to start getting more fancy, and if you've ever looked at things like Prototype, one of the things that was really always shown off about Prototype was it had all these cool UI widgets. jQuery also has cool UI widgets, but they're just in a separate library, the jQuery UI library. So, separate site, maintained by a separate group of guys. So you go and download it. And one of the really useful things about this site is they also contain, they have this little tool called the theme roller. Now, when you're going and downloading this, there's actually a lot of controls here. And you go to download it, and the way you download it is you actually toggle on which bits of script you want. This is kind of a nice way of packaging it up. It's like, oh, we've got a Windows installer, kind of installer, except it's a web page. So you can say, oh, I want this plugin, I want this plugin, or I don't want this plugin, and it builds you a custom version of the script for you, or you can just reference it off a CDN. Now, the other side of UI libraries is that they contain an awful lot of CSS. That's pretty normal. And, again, I'm a developer, not a designer, so I can't make things look good. But out of the box, they have this little tool called the theme roller, which lets you just build your own theme. And you've got a number to choose from. It's kind of like, in Visual Studio, you've got the controls and you've got all those little themes, professional. That's me. Or you can just go ahead and tweak them here in line. Go to the gallery. Dark Hive. There's me. There we go. And so it just gives you a CSS script for applying to all of the controls in the library, or again, if you're building a custom download, it will only include the scripts for the controls that you're interested in, and give you the appropriate images, which are all sprited. So it's all kind of at your fingertips to do. Now, the kind of hello world control of the jQuery UI library is the accordion, and we all love the accordion. Pretty useful little control in itself. Basically, imagine we've got a list of text blocks, and we just don't want to show them all at the same time. We want to expand and collapse them as we're navigating through them. Actually, a pretty useful control because, by and large, a lot of like for us, we've got a lot of marketing pages, and they're pretty text heavy. So this sort of control kind of would sit pretty well on those. And if I have a look at one of our product pages, you kind of see here, this is the kind of section where this kind of control would really fit in quite nicely, right? We've got all this, key features. It's awesome. It's awesome. But, I probably don't want to be blown away by all of that awesome text just yet. I want to highlight, maybe select one of these things, take my time, absorb the awesomeness one step at a time. And so I'll apply the accordion control to kind of make that tidy up. And again, this, a lot of these things are all about just making the UI a little bit nicer, applying some of these things that work, and improving the user experience. And here, it's really improving it by saving me having to scroll all over the page. So to bring this in, if we go to the Lightspeed product page. Here's an example of how I'm including this via CDN by just as an aside, using the Google one. Just FYI. So down in our document.ready, now something I probably haven't mentioned yet is that the place where most of your jQuery stuff will happen is in this function, this magical function called document.ready. And this basically is like the on load. As the page has loaded, do stuff. And so you trigger off most of your scripts, you set up your bindings in this function here. So you generally see this at the top of any page which uses jQuery. It will probably have something like document.ready. There's other ways of writing it. That's kind of how I write it. Okay, so what will I put in there? Well, I probably need to bring in... Oh, no, I've got jQuery referenced. This is where... What I'm going to do is I've got an unordered list of features, and I'm going to say features dot accordion. You can see now this is actually a plugin from the UI library, and it is shown in the Visual Studio IntelliSense, so that's kind of useful. Need to pass it some options, so I'll say auto height is false, and then the event I'm going to bind to is both click and hover intent. That looks right. That looks good. And that's looking nicer. Now, one of the other things I've done here is not just apply the accordion, but I've used, they've got an example on the page which showed me a little technique which is kind of interesting. And that is that jQuery not only allows us to bind to the sort of the standard events that we have declared on JavaScript objects, things like click or blur or mouse over. We can also build our own custom events. So this little effect here where I sort of hover over an element and it just triggers an event is actually something that I've added in custom. And it's declared up here. So that hover intent event is this little block of code here. You can go and swipe that off the jQuery site. That's what I did. But you can see here it just kind of builds up a new event by using a couple of things that already exist in the framework, basically the mouse over and mouse out events that already exist, and then it just uses a timer to say if I'm over an element and the timer ticks over a certain amount of time, then we'll trigger the event. So that's a really nice extensibility point in jQuery for starting to build up more advanced effects. Okay, so we added the accordion, and now that we're kind of getting into the groove with plugins, let's have a look at some other ones that are probably going to be somewhat useful. Now, on the front page of the Mindscape site, if you've been there, you'll notice we have like a block of all of our featured products. And being a marketing kind of guy, JD likes to see a lot of products there. So the list kind of goes on and on. Kind of a little bit too scroll heavy for my liking. So one of the things I said to him was, hey man, why don't we use like a scroller? That's a pretty obvious way of making that a little bit more condensed. And he's like, yeah, cool. Don't know how to do that that way. And I was like, oh, really? Oh, could do something like jQuery scroller. Look at all these plugins, heaps. So what I did is I just quickly did that, and I kind of wanted to make it look like this. Do a search. 5 seconds later, you kind of find, jQuery tools scrollable plugin. Yeah, that kind of looks like what I want. Let's go and download that and plug that in. So go to the home page. Oh, I've included that scrollable JS. Again, because this is a kind of a UI trick as well, one of the things you'll notice is that, again, plugins don't often just contain script, they also contain blocks of CSS that we have to use. And that makes sense. So I'll just paste this guy in, and where else is my style? There he is. Excellent. So this kind of effect, let's refresh that. Oh, it kind of almost looks like a scroller now. It doesn't do much, but you can kind of see that this kind of effect is built up in two ways. Basically, there's some functionality here, of course, but then you can see that what we're doing is basically having taking all of those blocks that were in a list, floating them left, and then making the panel really, really wide, but hiding it behind another layer. That's pretty common. That's kind of how a lot of these tricks on the web work. Another reason to kind of learn a little bit of CSS, kind of gives you some ideas about how these things can be broken down. So now what we're going to do is change it so that this guy rotates. He slides along and goes a little circuit, and has a little bit of a navigation aspect to him. And that's what that plugin was all about. It was about giving me the functionality behind that. And so to use that, back to the index page, I've read the docs for the plugin, looked at the example, and I've got a scroller div down here somewhere. There we go, where we applied that scrollable class. And I'm just going to say .scrollable. Hey, this is a third-party plugin. It's showing up in Visual Studio and IntelliSense. That's kind of cool. Take some arguments, circular, true. That's just going to keep it on repeat. And I want to include a navigator with it. So this kind of plugin has a number of different functions for extending, and this is an example of where we start chaining together jQuery functions. Because basically when we select a set, that returns a jQuery object, which is a set of elements that can be worked on with other jQuery functions. And then we say, .scrollable, and that operates on those and then returns a set of elements that we can operate on, and then we call navigator, and that does work, and away we go. So that's the mode of thinking you're in with jQuery, is you're thinking, oh, I've got the set, I've selected it via CSS selectors, and now I'm operating on it. Cool. Let's take a look at him in action. Cool, so now he looks a little bit slightly different. He's going to spin around. He's got a little bit of navigation there. Nothing too hard. JD, where's my pay rise? Right. So scrollers, that's a pretty common one. Another one that's kind of like all over the web is the lightbox. This was like the plugin from the prototype days. What does it do? Well, of course, you've seen what it does. It shows an image. So this is again, you go search for all jQuery lightbox. Yep, there's a lot of them. I kind of like this one called FancyBox. There's the URL, fancybox.net. Yeah, here we go. It just kind of looks like, again, you kind of just sort of check these things out. They kind of look nice, kind of look like, oh yeah, that fits for what I want to do. Has support for titles and things like that. So let's go ahead and apply that. So again, I would have downloaded this plugin. You can see here I've downloaded it and dropped it in its own little directory here. FancyBox. It's got some images with it this time. So again, plugins don't just contain script, don't just contain character styles. They also might bring in other resources like images, some JS, some CSS, and we're going to have to bang that into our site. So we'll drop those in, and then we'll drop in a call to use the FancyBox with these options. And this is just basically going to operate on the image here. Maybe what we'll do is display this when it pops up. And the way the conventions for this plugin is that it has an A tag which it uses, and the A tag's href is going to be the image it loads in to show in the pop-up. There we go. One of the things that you kind of start getting into when you look at plugins like this, which have a bit of a snazzy effect to them, you can sort of see that goes, is that these are called easings, and anyone who's kind of used to like Flash or any kind of animation framework is probably, they've got the term of easing in their head. An easing is basically like a function over time which the animation will play at. So you can think of it like the animation that probably reconciles in my head at the moment is linear. It goes from A to B at a steady rate. But it doesn't have to go that way. It could go, like with that crazy effect I just did, could go like, slow and then real sharp at the end. So it could be a nice little sort of spline curve. And out of the box, jQuery, the core library, comes with a number of easings. And these are things like the fade, sort of simple fades, and linear, obviously. And if you want to get some more interesting ones, you can see here the one that I was using, Elastic. You start including an easing pack, or use the UI library, which again brings in additional types of easing, more advanced. Basically they're just a function which someone has written for doing the transform over time. Those are kind of useful to have in the back of your mind. Maybe bring in an easing library as a core part of what you're doing if you're starting to do animations on the screen, because the out-of-the-box ones kind of do get a little bit boring. Good to have a few tricks in your arsenal there. Okay, so now that we've kind of banged out a couple of simple plugins, we probably start to look at writing some ourselves. We go and search for a plugin. We can't find one. Oh no, what do I do? Well, we write our own, and that's where jQuery gets quite fun. What's really good about the framework is it's very easy to extend. I mean, basically what we've seen when we looked at plugins is we had this selector set of elements dot my plugin function, because that's overloaded on the jQuery object itself. And how do we do that? Well, there's two ways of doing that. Either we can write this kind of syntax here, which jQuery.fn.myPlugin equals function. Or if we're bringing in not just a function, but maybe a couple of functions collectively, or some other little internal methods that we're going to call, we might use jQuery.extend, and that basically extends the prototype of the jQuery object to include other types of other functions that we want. When we're doing that, you'll probably want to keep in mind this keyword to refer to whatever element we are currently operating on, and remember that will be perhaps in a set of objects. Don't have to worry about that, you just think about the object itself. And then we can use jQuery selector to get back anything else in the jQuery tree to work with. Good little document on their site, on the jQuery site, about plugin authoring. Have a read of that if you want to delve into that realm. Or what's really easy to do is just go and download someone else's plugin, have a look at how they've structured it, get your head around what conventions are they using, and that's going to be your starting point. That's kind of how I thought, well, surely it can't be too hard. It isn't. Just get in there, get stuck in. So what might we want to write that hasn't been written before? Well, one thing that I came across on the early days is, I came across from the ASP.NET Ajax world, and the control in that world is the update panel, of course. And that made it really easy to just build these forms where stuff happened via Ajax posts and stuff updated on your screen, and you didn't really have to worry about it. It was magic. And I kind of missed that when I moved over to jQuery, because you had to wire all these things up individually, and it was kind of a little bit more time consuming. But hey, no worries, we can write a plugin for this that just kind of simulates what an update panel does, because all it does is post back a form, get back a response of new HTML, and then replaces blocks of HTML, swaps them out on the page. So imagine we've got our shopping cart on the Mindscape site, and this is what we want to do. We want to basically, when these kind of events are triggered, we want to refresh these types of elements because they're the bits that are changing on the page. How would we do that? Well, we'd take a couple of things that we already know. We would use that post or Ajax methods to wire up to those events to send some information back to the server about, hey, this is the new state of the form, tell me what the view should look like. And then we can scan the response and use a function which is in the core library called .html and swap that content out. And that's pretty easy. Let's go to the shopping cart and have a quick look at that. So again, I'll go and buy a license, and here's the page. Now, at the moment, if I change that, nothing happens, right? This is the problem. No good. So to fix this, I'm going to crack open this guy. I've already written the plugin, so I won't have to rewrite it on stage. I'm using jQuery.extend here, okay? And I'm doing that because I've got a few things that I'm bringing in. I'm bringing in an object called loader, and I'm bringing in a couple of functions. And the function I'm going to focus on here is this Ajax postback. It takes an URL, some data to send to the server, and a callback. If the callback doesn't exist, we'll just create one for us, which calls this function here. And then it just uses that Ajax method to send it to the server, get back a response. And with the response, what we're going to do is find all elements on the page where we put this little hidden little bit of markup on there called Ajax refresh equals true. So that will identify a series of divs which I want to swap out, and it will find those on the page, find the equivalent element in the data that's coming back. And you can see here, this will be just a blob of string text from the server, which has come back as a response. We can wrap that as a jQuery object. That actually just suddenly automatically expands it as an object tree. That's pretty neat. And then we can just go, well, this piece from here is going to go here, and this here, and we've swapped it out. Okay? And that's all this plugin is going to do. Wouldn't say it's the most efficient plugin, but it can work. And the way we'll wire this up, we'll say, let's go to my checkout page. For these three elements, and these are the three things I sort of highlighted on that screenshot, we're going to post back to these methods here. Here's the data we're sending back. You see, rather than submitting a form, we're actually constructing specific key value pairs to send back. So we can construct our own form data rather than just having to have an actual form that we're submitting. And then the callback is going to refresh that and then rebind these handlers by executing this method again. Okay? Why do we need to do that? Well, because if we're swapping out blocks of text which these guys actually live inside, then they're going to be destroyed, new objects are going to come over, and the eventing isn't going to be wired up. So there we go, now it's all wired up, just like that. Posting, swapping it out with the .html, quickly and easily we built a little plugin. Now, with jQuery 1.3, I built this kind of back in the day. With 1.3, something very useful came along that makes this kind of plugin a lot easier. And that's a function called live. And if we quickly drop back here, what I'm doing in the callback is I'm saying, oh, do work and then rebind. And I told you why I was rebinding, right? Because things get destroyed and have to be recreated and I have to rewire events. With one thing to know is if you're ever faced with that problem, learn about this little function here in the core library, live. And what it does is it says for anything that matches this selector both now and in the future, you know, when I'm swapping things in the future, things get created in the future, if they match that selector, wire up this function to them. So all of a sudden all that plumbing code I had to write in the past just goes away. I just say that .live change function, get rid of all the rest. Okay, so now that we've got this and we kind of know how to build a basic plugin, the last thing we'll look at is how do we copy a cool technique that we've seen? Because usually what happens is, of course, you know, like anything, you go around the web yourself and you see something that looks pretty cool and you think, I could do that, that would look really good on my site. So, you know, this is our accounts page, you know, it has a list of things you've bought and has a little product box, that looks kind of nice. But you know, I go to the search engines these days and they have the, you know, the lives, this infinite search where you scroll down and you hover over an image and it spans it out and puts a little pop up there, and that's pretty neat. I say, that looks good, that looks like me. Why can't I have my little product page, you know, subscription page like this? I have all my boxes, hover over something, it expands out and puts a little bit of text around it. That would be kind of neat. So that's the kind of thing, you look at that and you say, that's cool, I want to do that. How do we break that down? Well, again, pretty simply, we just take some basics like, oh, what is the event we're going to wire up to? We'd wire up to hover. We'd use some animation to animate that going from small to big, and that's, you know, basically, you can see here the animate function, again, part of the core library, something really useful for saying, take an element and go from what it is now, change these properties on it, the width and the height, over a period of time with an easing. Nice and easy. It looks kind of cool. So that's one half of that problem. The other half is how do I, you know, pop out a little information div around it. Well, that part is actually really easy with jQuery. We saw that at the beginning, right? Fade in, fade out, hide and show divs. It all comes back to hiding and showing divs. Hiding and showing layers. So we'll quickly apply that, and what I'm going to do, I've got my account page. I've already sort of set out the layout, had to be tweaked obviously to get rid of the text. If I crack that guy open, and I'm going to drop in one last block of text. What I'm going to do is, for each of those little thumbnails, image nail class, I'm going to use the animate method. A couple of things you might want to use with that. There's this .stop, which basically says when this event fires, stop any animation that's currently occurring on it, because otherwise you could get into a pretty wacky chain of events. And we're going to animate it this way. We're going to move it slightly and we're going to expand it out. And so applying that really quickly just gives us that effect. So we get the slide out effect. That looks kind of nice. And then the other part of it is I've got some information about the subscription here in a class called info, which is currently hidden, of course, because I can't see it. So how would we do that? Well, this dot parent dot find .info .fade in this find .info .hide. There we go. And the little trick here at the end of it is that you can see here that those hiding and showings are part of a function that's on this little event, the animate event, which is when the animation completes, and only if it completes, run this guy. And so you get that nice little, I can slide over a few things pretty fast, and it doesn't trigger the little hide and show div until I actually finish and completely hover over something. So I took a technique, seen it on those search engines, it's not too fancy for me, I can apply it to my site, and I can quickly break it down. And you can see even just a little bit of jQuery knowledge can be pretty dangerous in the wrong hands, like mine, and can allow us to build something kind of interesting and cool and really bring some life to our sites. So with that, I'll wrap up and just pose you the challenge. Go, take this knowledge, take it to the web, take it to your websites and apply it. Go download jQuery, download the UI, explore plugins, get that IntelliSense, go for gold. It's fun, it's good. Cheers guys, and have a good tech ed.